Opposition. Government. Foreign intervention in behalf of Syrian rebels. US-led intervention against ISIL. The civil uprising phase of the Syrian civil war, or as it was sometimes called by the media, the Syrian Revolution, was an early stage of protests, with subsequent violent reaction by the Syrian Arab Republic, lasting from March to 28 July 2011, as part of the wider spread Arab Spring in the Arab world. The uprising, initially demanding democratic reforms, evolved from initially minor protests, beginning as early as January 2011 and transformed into massive protests in March. The uprising was marked by massive anti-government opposition demonstrations against the Ba'athist government led by Bashar al-Assad, meeting with police and military violence, massive arrests and a brutal crackdown, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of wounded. Despite Bashar al-Assad's attempts to stop the protests with the massive crackdown and use of censorship on one hand and concessions on the other, by the end of April it became clear the situation was getting out of his control and his government deployed numerous troops on the ground. The civil uprising phase led to the emergence of militant opposition movements and massive defections from the Syrian army, which gradually transformed the conflict from a civil uprising to an armed rebellion, and later a full-scale civil war. The rebel Free Syrian Army was created on 29 July 2011, marking the transition into armed insurgency. Massive protests and a violent crackdown led to international condemnation and support for the protesters. As the war progressed in October to November 2011, protests against the government and the war strengthened with 23 deaths and hundreds of thousands of protesters. The protests were marred by a massive crackdown which angered more protesters in northern and western Syria. Protests and riots continued by students and the youth despite aggressive suppression. Before the uprising in Syria began in mid-March 2011, protests were relatively modest, considering the wave of unrest that was spreading across the Arab world. Syria, until March 2011, for decades had remained superficially tranquil, largely due to fear among the people of the secret police arresting critical citizens. Factors contributing to social unrest in Syria include socio-economic stressor caused by the Iraqi conflict, as well as the most intense drought ever recorded in the region. Minor protests calling for government reforms began in January and continued into March. At this time, massive protests were occurring in Cairo against Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and in Syria on 3 February via the websites Facebook and Twitter. A day of rage was called for by activists against the government of Bashar al-Assad, to be held on Friday, 4 February. This did not result in protests. Major unrest began on 15 March in Damascus, yet in the southern city of Daraa, sometimes called the cradle of the revolution. Protests had been triggered on 6 March by the incarceration and torture of 15 young students from prominent families who were arrested for writing anti-government graffiti in the city, reading a trademark slogan of the Arab Spring. The government claimed that the boys weren't attacked, and that Qatar incited the majority of the protests. Writer and analyst Lawi al-Hussein, referencing the Arab Spring ongoing at that time, wrote that Syria is now on the map of countries in the region with an uprising. Demonstrators clashed with local police, and confrontations escalated on 18 March after Friday prayers. Security forces attacked protesters gathered at the Omari Mosque using water cannons and tear gas, followed by live fire, killing 4. On 20 March, a mob burned down the Ba'ath Party headquarters and other public buildings. Security forces quickly responded, firing live ammunition at crowds, and attacking the focal points of the demonstrations. The two-day assault resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers and 15 protesters. Meanwhile, minor protests occurred elsewhere in the country. Protesters demanded the release of political prisoners, the abolition of Syria's 48-year emergency law, more freedoms, and an end to pervasive government corruption. The events led to a Friday of Dignity on 18 March, when large-scale protests broke out in several cities, including Bani Yas, Damascus, al-Hasaka, Dara, Deir az-Zor, and Hama. Police responded to the protests with tear gas, water cannons, and beatings. At least 6 people were killed and many others injured. On the 25th of March, mass protests spread nationwide. As demonstrators emerged after Friday prayers, at least 20 protesters were reportedly killed by security forces. Protests subsequently spread to other Syrian cities, including Homs, Hama, Banias, Jassim, Aleppo, Damascus and Latakia. Over 70 protesters in total were reported killed, even before the uprising began. The Syrian government